The marketplace of Vorlak Station was a chaos of neon smoke and murmured deceit. Electric banners flickered above cracked walls, casting sickly blue light across rusted merchant stalls. Every breath of air carried the scent of metal, unwashed bodies, and promises you did not want fulfilled. Captain Jackson Vale stepped through the crowd like a shadow in motion. His coat brushed the side of his thigh, concealing the weight of the pulse pistol at his hip. His boots clicked softly on ferroglass tiles, but every step spoke a language of confidence. He had done this 100 times before. Negotiate, exchange, leave, never look back. He had come for a rare plasma stabilizer. He would leave with something far more dangerous. The deal was already going sour by the time he reached Vorak's stall. The alien trader was massive, green-scaled, with one clouded eye and a laugh like a broken air filter. Vorak leaned over the crates, his breath thick with fermented spice. "You drive a hard bargain, human," he growled, tapping a claw against the table. "No one else dares argue with Vorak on his own turf." Jackson remained unmoved. "Then maybe it's time someone did." Vorak hissed a sound that might have been amusement. "Fine, stabilizer is yours, but the price still too low. You must take a bonus." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "Not interested in your leftovers." "It is not scrap," Vorak insisted, gesturing toward the shadows behind the stall. "It is organic, a body, still alive, still useful, no implants, untouched, exotic even." A figure stepped forward. She wore no chains, no collar, only a thin silver robe torn at the hem, dust clinging to her bare feet. Her skin shimmered faintly violet beneath the lights. Her eyes, however, were what caught Jackson mid-thought, silver irises with a depth he had never seen in a slave. Not fear, not numbness, control. The kind of stillness you only saw in apex predators right before the strike. "This is Ceres," Vorak said with a smile full of teeth. "Etherian stock, extremely rare. I took her off a failed smuggler. She says little, eats little, but very visually pleasing, yes?" Jackson studied her in silence. Her gaze met his and held. No flinching, no begging. "How much for her freedom?" Jackson asked. Vorak blinked. "What? You said she was part of the deal, so name a price, not as property, as person." Vorak laughed. "Freedom? What will she do with that? She has no home, no ship, no function." Jackson stepped closer, his voice low but dangerous. "Then it's good she has a captain." A long pause. Then Vorak grunted and spat. "Take her, she is yours, but do not come back if she guts you in your sleep." Jackson turned to her. "Can you walk?" Ceres nodded once. "No restraints," he said. She stepped forward without hesitation. No limp, no hesitation. And as she fell in step beside him, Jackson knew, whatever this was, it was no slave rescue. This was a beginning. He didn't ask her anything else until they cleared the station airlock. Then, as the door to his ship sealed behind them, he finally spoke. "You have a name?" Her voice was calm, quiet, measured. "Ceres." He glanced at her as the engines began to warm beneath his boots. "You don't look like a prisoner." Her answer was a whisper. "That's because I never was." The hum of the Valkyrie's main corridor was low and steady, like the quiet breathing of a creature that had seen too much. Sleek and black-hulled, the ship was built for speed and discretion, with just enough firepower to discourage regret. It wasn't the biggest vessel in the quadrant, but it was Jackson's, and on this ship nothing happened that he didn't allow. At least until now. Ceres walked ahead of him, calm, poised, barefoot on cold alloy floors. She had not asked where they were going, had not glanced at the weapons on the walls or the crewmates who passed them, stiffening slightly at the sight of her. A woman bought from a slaver, walking like she owned the air she breathed. Jackson didn't like variables, but Saris wasn't a variable. She was a mystery, written in a language he didn't yet understand. He watched her pause before the navigation panel at the command deck, her silver eyes scanning the layout like she had seen it before. Her hand hovered over the control screen, fingers flexing slightly. "That's restricted," Jackson said from behind her. "I wasn't going to touch," Saris replied, not looking back. "I've just never seen a Mark 12 interface paired with a human-level translation core. You're not military, but this is military grade." Jackson stepped beside her. "You recognize ship code?" She finally looked at him, and there was something like amusement dancing at the edge of her expression. "I recognize a lot of things I'm not supposed to." He studied her in the dim light. "You weren't born a slave." "No," she said. "But you already knew that." Jackson leaned back against the control console, arms crossed. "So, let's stop dancing. Who are you, really, Saris?" She tilted her head. "You bought me. Don't you already own the answer?" He didn't smile. "I bought your freedom. That means you don't owe me anything. But it also means I don't have to keep you on this ship if you're a threat." Saris stepped closer, not menacing but deliberate. "If I wanted to be a threat," she said quietly, "you wouldn't be standing." The air between them thickened. Not hostile, not warm, wary, like two apex predators circling the edges of something neither wanted to name. Jackson broke the silence. "You have training, advanced, tactical. You moved through Vorak's security net like you were never really caught." "Because I wasn't," she said. "I got myself captured." He blinked. "Why?" Saris looked away for the first time, not from shame but from strategy. "Because I needed a way off-world, and I needed someone not aligned, not compromised. Vorak only trades with the kind of people desperate enough to cut their own leash. People who ask no questions." Jackson's voice lowered. "And you chose me." She nodded. "Why?" This time, her answer came softer, slower. "Because when I looked at you, you didn't see an investment. You didn't see an object. You saw a problem you might be willing to solve." He let that sit between them for a while. Then he asked, "Are you running from something?" "Yes," she said. "Are they coming?" "Probably." Jackson considered that for a beat. Then he turned toward the console, ran a security lockdown protocol on the outer airlock, and triggered a stealth field around the hull. "You have 1 hour to tell me who and why. Until then, you stay out of restricted systems and you don't leave this ship." Ceres gave a small nod, her tone cool. "Fair." Jackson started to walk away, but paused at the door. "One more thing." She raised a brow. "I've worked with spies, assassins, and half-mad ex-nobles, but I've never met someone who looked so much like a secret pretending to be quiet." She said nothing, but when he left, she turned back to the nav console, placed her palm an inch from the glowing panel, and whispered something in a language the ship didn't recognize. The console responded. Only for a blink, a flicker of light, barely enough to notice, but the ship had, and so had she. The Valkyries drifted silently through a corridor of deep space, far from trade routes and tracking signals. No comm traffic, no lights from nearby systems, just blackness and stars, an ocean too vast for memory. And in the heart of that silence, two people sat at a small table on the ship's lower deck. Jackson Vale sipped synthetic coffee from a dented steel mug, elbows on the table, expression unreadable. Across from him, Saris leaned back slightly, her silver eyes gleaming in the soft gold light of the console above them. Her hands were calm, folded in her lap, not hiding, not waiting, ready. It was Jackson who finally broke the silence. Start from the beginning. Saris nodded once. Not slow, not dramatic, just honest. My name is Saris of House Arathion, first bloodline of the Etherian Constellate, heir to the throne I never wanted, and fugitive of the empire I was born to rule. Jackson blinked. Princess. Technically, she replied, voice steady. But I abandoned that title the moment they tried to turn me into a bargaining chip. He didn't interrupt. I was supposed to be betrothed to a regional prince from the Kralin border, she continued. A political unification. They never asked if I wanted it. I refused. So they locked me down, cut my access, grounded my personal fleet. I was going to disappear behind palace walls. Her fingers flexed once, then stilled again. I escaped during the planetary summit, staged an internal systems failure, created a fake assassination attempt, then routed myself into Vorak's slave manifest. They would never expect a royal to sink that low, but I knew he'd try to sell me quickly, which is what I wanted. She looked him straight in the eye. I didn't know who I'd meet on the other side, but when I saw you, I chose to stay visible. Jackson leaned back slowly. You're telling me I pulled a royal fugitive out of a slaver's trade zone in front of 5 black market syndicates and 2 bounty brokers. She gave a half smile. Not just a royal, the last living direct heir to the Etherian Constellate. And now that you know, you're officially harboring a threat to imperial unity. He blew out a breath. You know how many people would have killed for this intel. I do, she said, her voice suddenly softer. That's why I didn't tell them, I told you. He stared at her quiet. Why me, Saris? Her eyes didn't waver. Because you didn't flinch when you saw what they called me, because you walked me out without asking for my story, because you looked at me and didn't see value. You saw choice. Jackson set the mug down, slowly. You need protection, he said. Resources, allies. I need a ship, she replied. I need silence, and I need someone who doesn't belong to the old systems. He looked at her for a long time. You planned all this, he muttered. Not all, she said. I couldn't plan you. They sat in the quiet hum of the Valkyries. No orders, no urgency. Just a mercenary and a would-be monarch suspended in the moment between before and after. I should hand you over, Jackson said eventually, voice low. You won't, Saris answered. Why? Because something in you is tired of watching power be traded like weapons. He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. Outside, the stars turned slowly, each one a history, a war, a possibility. Inside, Jackson nodded. One condition. Saris raised a brow. If I'm flying into Imperial crossfire for you, he said, you tell me everything. No more surprises. She leaned forward. Everything I am, I've already handed to you. Their eyes held, and something deeper than trust sparked, quiet and electric. This wasn't rescue, it was alignment, and the galaxy would not be ready for what it meant. The engines of the Valkyries purred low and steady as the ship cut through the dark, hugging the edge of an ion storm cloud near the Varelian drift. Outside the cockpit viewport, electric filaments arched like veins across the void, pulsing with silent fury. A storm like that could fry a fleet in seconds, but Jackson Vale wasn't the kind to run in straight lines, or hide in safe ones. Inside, the tension was thick. Saris stood behind him, arms folded, her eyes locked on the navigation screen. Her usually calm demeanor was strained, her voice clipped. They're not scouting, they're tracking. Jackson didn't glance at her. I know. She stepped closer. That's a Corellian war signature, Etherian military grade. It's not random. Jackson's fingers flew across the console. Transponder is masked, signature ghosted. No way they could have traced us. They didn't trace you, she said flatly. They traced me. At that, he turned. How? Saris didn't blink. The moment I formed the bond. Jackson's eyes narrowed. Quantum resonance? She nodded. Unregistered, instinctive. I wasn't supposed to engage with anyone biologically capable of synaptic alignment. But it happened. When you freed me, when I chose you, something shifted. The bond broadcasted just for a moment. Long enough for them to catch the echo. Jackson leaned back. So, I'm not just flying a fugitive royal, I'm flying a beacon. Only to them, Saris said. But now that they know, they won't stop. Not until I'm back in chains or dead, Jackson finished. He stood and activated a hard reroute. Then, let's make them work for it. The ship tilted sharply as he guided them between storm fractures, electric arcs dancing just meters from the hull. The inertial dampeners strained. Your bond, Jackson said, eyes locked on the controls. Is it permanent? Saris hesitated. It's layered, physical, energetic, emotional. Once formed, it can't be severed, not without destroying the neurological pathways it created. He didn't speak, but something in his jaw shifted. She caught it. You didn't choose this, she said quietly. He looked at her steady. Did you? She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then softly, not with my mind. But my soul. Maybe. They stood in silence as the storm rolled past them, plasma lashing across the void like celestial fire. On the radar, the pursuers stayed close, like wolves behind a wounded deer. Suddenly, Saris turned and began tapping commands into the ship's auxiliary interface. I can give us cover. Jackson moved beside her. You're not suggesting... Quantum shadow, she said. It's risky. It creates a false energy imprint, mimicking a ship's exact behavior 5 seconds out of sync. It'll make it look like we're still moving forward while we double back, but it'll drain me. Jackson hesitated. How much? Enough to drop me for hours, she said. Maybe more. He shook his head. Too dangerous. She faced him fully now. They won't stop, Jackson. They want me back because I'm not a person to them. I'm a symbol. If they catch us, they'll use me to justify every kind of tyranny you've ever fought against. I won't let that happen. Not again. Jackson clenched his fists. He had faced death 100 times. But the idea of watching her collapse under her own power just to protect him twisted something inside. Okay, he said, but you're not doing it alone. They linked hands. Her skin felt warm against his. A current passed between them, barely perceptible but real. Saris closed her eyes. Ready. The ship dimmed. Outside, a second Valkyris flickered into existence, a ghost ship trailing ahead on the exact same path. The pursuers locked onto the decoy instantly, veering off course like metal to magnet. Inside, Saris staggered. Jackson caught her. She whispered, breath shallow. We have a window. Use it. He carried her gently to the captain's chair, his arms steady even as his heart raced. Rest, he said. I'll get us out. She nodded faintly, eyes half-lidded. Jackson? Yeah? When I chose you, I didn't make a mistake. And then she slept. Outside, the storm swallowed their trail whole, and the chase began again. The Valkyries drifted quietly beyond the reach of pursuit, nestled in the shadow of a dying star. The light outside was dim and golden, casting long, fluid shadows through the ship's interior. The storm was behind them now, but the silence left in its wake was something else entirely. Jackson Vale sat beside the med couch, elbows resting on his knees, watching Saris breathe. Her body was still, but her skin glowed faintly. ethereal light pulsing from the lines of her neural pathways. Not technology, not magic. Something older, something alien, the quantum bond. He didn't know what he had expected when she told him it existed. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in survival, strategy, action. But now, sitting there, feeling the strange rhythm of her pulse syncing with his own, he knew this wasn't myth. It was real. Sarah stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, silver, luminous, more awake than any eyes had a right to be. She scanned the ceiling, then shifted slowly toward Jackson, her voice a soft rasp. "You stayed." He met her gaze. "Told you I would." She gave a faint smile. "You always mean what you say." Jackson reached for a nearby thermos and poured a small amount of liquid into a metal cup. "Try this. You'll need to rebuild your electrolytes." She sat up with effort, took the cup in trembling hands, sipped. Her eyes widened slightly. "Spiced root tea?" He smirked. "Earth recipe. My mother used to make it when I got sick." A silence stretched between them, not empty, charged. The kind of silence that hums between two people when there's nothing left to hide and everything still left to say. Saris broke it first. "When I formed the bond," she said, voice steady now, "it wasn't a mistake." Jackson looked at her. She continued. "The Etherian bond was never about mating, rituals, or royalty. It's ancient. Older than our empire, a soul thread, quantum alignment. Our ancestors believed it only happened when two lives collided at the exact point of choice. Not blood, not politics. Choice. Choice." Jackson swallowed. "And you chose me." "I didn't plan to," she said. "But the moment you broke my chains, not just with your hands, but with your eyes, I knew. You didn't see a problem to fix or a prize to hide. You saw a person. No one's done that in a long time." He reached across the small table between them, not for her hand, but for presence. "And what do we do now, Cirrus? Now that we're whatever this is?" She leaned forward, resting her fingers on his. "Now we learn how to move through this galaxy not as fugitives, but as something the Empire never expected. Unified, free, bound, but unowned." Jackson nodded slowly. "Then we start here." He stood, walked to the center of the observation chamber and dimmed the lights. The star outside flickered through the window, a dying giant, radiating waves of gold and red. Saris rose from the couch, her balance unsure at first, but steady with his help. They stood in the center of the room, the stars watching. "Etherians have a ritual," she said. "When the bond forms fully, we exchange light. Not just energy, but memory. Trust. It's how we confirm the bond is mutual." She raised her palm. Jackson hesitated, then mirrored her. Their hands touched. The moment they connected, warmth surged through his chest, spreading across his limbs. Not heat, resonance, a feeling like gravity bending in his favor. And then he saw it. Her memory. A palace in twilight. A child hidden behind golden curtains, watching soldiers march. A girl being dressed in ceremonial silks she never asked to wear. A voice telling her, "You are valuable because you are rare." And her voice screaming silently, "No, I am valuable because I choose to be." Then the memory folded, and his came forward. A boy on a burned-out colony, his brother gone, his hands gripping a scavenged rifle too large for his arms, a man telling him to run. And he didn't, he stayed, because someone had to. Their hands dropped, but the bond remained. No words passed between them for a long moment. Then Saris whispered, "Now we are seen." Jackson stepped closer, cupping her face gently. "No more running," he said. She leaned into his touch. "Not unless we run together." And beneath the light of a dying star, two souls that had been born for anything but love, found something more powerful than destiny. They found each other. The Valkyries hovered just above the dense orbit of Nithara, a neutral moon long known for its diplomatic stations and lack of official questions. It was here, beneath the opaline cloud layers, that the envoy had requested the meeting. Not a meeting. The meeting. Inside the ship, Jackson Vale stood in front of the central mirror in his cabin, adjusting the collar of a formal black tunic, his first in years. His face was calm, but his jaw was set. Outside, half a dozen Etherian guard vessels had arrived with a ceremonial escort. Not weapons drawn, not yet, but the air was heavy with tension. Behind him, Saris stepped forward. She wore traditional Etherian robes, not of gold and grandeur, but of status. Deep violet with silver thread curling through the sleeves, signaling royal lineage. But more than her garments, it was the way she stood. Tall, centered, unapologetic. "I never thought I'd wear this again," she said softly. Jackson turned to her. "They're here to drag you back." "No," she said. "They're here to test me. If they think the bond is real, they'll have no choice but to recognize it. And if they don't?" Saris looked him dead in the eye. "Then they'll try to erase me." The landing bay doors opened with a mechanical hiss. Etherian soldiers marched in pairs, armor polished like obsidian. And at their center, Commander Wren stepped forward, tall, grim, with an air of steel-clad tradition. "Princess Saris," he greeted, voice formal. "You've been difficult to locate." "I chose not to be found," she replied. Wren's eyes flicked to Jackson. "And this is the one?" "His name is Jackson Vale," she said. "And yes, he is my bonded." A murmur rippled through the guards. Wren stepped closer. "You do understand what that implies, that you've created a cross-species quantum bond with a human mercenary. This could destabilize alliances, threaten noble lines, reshape inheritance structures across 3 systems." Saris took a breath, then reached for Jackson's hand. "I don't care about systems," she said. "I care about what is real, and this," she looked at Jackson, their palms now glowing faintly where they touched, "is real." Wren didn't move. Then, "Prove it." Saris and Jackson nodded. Together they closed their eyes, the bond activated. A pulse of radiant energy burst from their clasped hands, rippling outward in a circle of light that shimmered against the walls. The Etherian soldiers instinctively stepped back. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't tech. It was raw, neural synchronization. Impossible to fake. Impossible to replicate. Commander Wren stepped forward slowly, scanning the resonance field, and then he bowed. Full, formal. Submission before proof. "The Council will have questions," he said as he straightened. "But no one can question this." Saris released a breath she didn't realize she'd held. "And there's more," she said quietly. She turned to Jackson, placing his hand gently over her lower abdomen. His eyes widened. "You're sure?" Saris nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I can feel him." Commander Wren took another step forward. "A royal heir?" "No," Saris said. "A child born of 2 worlds," Jackson added, "of 2 choices." The chamber fell silent. And in that silence the future changed. No crown had been passed, no throne claimed, but something greater had been created. A new bloodline, a new path. A challenge to the systems that thought they could control everything. Jackson squeezed her hand gently. "Still think I'm just a mercenary?" Saris smiled, eyes shining. "Number? You're my beginning." The Valkyries was barely halfway through its departure sequence when the alarms screamed to life. Red band distress signal. Unidentified assault ships inbound. Trajectory locked. Inside the cockpit, Jackson Vale was already at the controls, voice sharp and clipped. Shields up. Hard burn vector 92. Prepare for evasive pattern gamma. Behind him, Saris moved with fluid urgency, her royal robes replaced by a reinforced flight suit woven with Etherian combat mesh. Her silver eyes glowed faintly, not with panic but focus. "They're not from the Council," she said. "These signature mercenaries, hired hands, black-class trackers." Jackson growled. "Someone's not ready to let you go." "Or what I'm carrying." Outside, 3 small attack craft streaked across the darkness, their weapon systems glowing red-hot. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to extract or erase. Jackson slammed the controls hard left. The ship rolled violently, dodging the first wave of plasma fire. But the next would hit. The Valkyries was fast, but not built for prolonged dogfights without reinforcements, and none were coming. Saris moved to the co-pilot station, already interfacing with the ship's quantum core. "I can overload the resonance chamber. Short burst pulse. It'll knock out their sensors." "You're still recovering from the bond," Jackson warned. She looked at him, voice steady. "We don't have time for recovery. We have to end this." She connected with the ship, her neural pathways lighting like threads of starlight. The energy surged, humming through the deck, through the air, through him. For a second, Jackson could feel her heartbeat inside his own, fast, fierce, alive. The quantum pulse launched. A ring of violet and gold light exploded outward from the Valkyrus, stunning the assault ships mid-flight. 2 veered off course, colliding into the asteroid debris belt. 1 remained, damaged, but still closing in. Jackson narrowed his eyes. "Let's finish it." He rerouted auxiliary power, drawing energy from the core Saris had just activated. She didn't resist. She amplified. The ship became a conduit of their bond, their intention, their fury. "Targeting lock acquired," Saris said. "Firing," Jackson whispered. A lance of pure resonance energy ripped through the remaining enemy ship. No explosion, just silence. A shutdown so total it looked like the stars had swallowed it whole. And then, calm. The lights dimmed, the ship cooled. Inside the cockpit, Saris sank back in her chair, breath shaky but eyes clear. "They'll send more." Jackson leaned forward, touching her hand. "Then we keep flying, together." A soft chime echoed through the ship's main display, a coded message from the Etherian Council. He opened it. A single line. Heir designation accepted. Royal lineage bonded. Authority recognized. Saris stared at the screen. "So that's it," she murmured. "They believe it now." Jackson smirked. "They don't just believe it, they fear it." She turned to him. "Do you?" He moved closer, brushing his fingers along her cheek. "I don't fear what you are," he said. "I honor it, and I stand beside it." Saris smiled, weary but radiant. "Then you stand beside a queen?" He kissed her forehead gently. I stand beside Saris, the woman who rewrote the fate they tried to force on her." Outside, the wreckage drifted in silence. But within the ship, a new center of gravity had formed. Not a crown, not a throne. A family. Unbreakable. The spires of Etheria Prime shimmered in the early light, their crystal domes reflecting soft hues of lavender and gold across the marble terraces. The capital had never been this quiet before, never this still, as if the entire planet was holding its breath. Inside the royal sanctuary, far above the city, Saris stood before the panoramic window, her hand resting lightly on her stomach. Her silhouette glowed faintly, not from any crown, but from the life within her. A child, their child, the first of his kind. Behind her the doors opened. Jackson Vale entered without ceremony, no guards, no titles, just the man who had walked with her through fire and chosen to stay long after the embers had cooled. He moved to her side, saying nothing at first. He didn't need to. Their fingers intertwined. "Did you sleep?" he asked gently. "A little," she said. He kicked. Jackson smiled, already restless, like his mother. "Stubborn," she corrected, "like his father." They stood in silence, watching as transport ships drifted in from distant systems. Diplomats, scholars, even warriors, all gathering for the announcement. Not just of lineage, but of legacy. The council had resisted at first, a human consort, a hybrid heir. But after the bond was proven, after the ambush and the survival, there had been no more room for doubt. Power no longer belonged only to the bloodlines of old. It belonged to those who dared to define their own. Cirrus turned to Jackson, her voice soft but clear. "Do you think the galaxy is ready for him?" Jackson looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe not, but we'll raise him to be ready for the galaxy." She nodded slowly. "He'll walk both paths, human strength, Etherian grace, but more than that, he'll grow up knowing he was wanted, chosen, not for power, but for love." The ceremony began with no horns, no flames, just two hands placed over a heart. Heron. As the crowd stood in reverent silence, Ceres stepped forward and placed a single glowing orb on the pedestal, the ancient Etherian tradition for a new life declared. The orb flared to life, radiant, pulsing with dual energy signatures. Etherian, human, unified. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The high priests bowed. The oldest nobles remained frozen. And then, one by one, they began to kneel, not to the old order, but to something new. Later that night, on the private balcony, Jackson held Ceres in his arms as they watched stars swirl above the capital. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the crystal vine trees nearby. "You were never just a passenger on this journey," he whispered. "You were the map." She rested her head on his shoulder. "And you were the compass." He laughed, quiet and real. "We really changed everything, didn't we?" "No," she said. "We became everything they were too afraid to imagine." In the nursery behind them, the lights dimmed gently as sensors tracked the tiny life breathing in perfect rhythm. One heartbeat born of two worlds. One story just beginning. Not royalty, not rebellion, just family. If you had the chance to start a legacy that broke every rule but healed generations of pain, would you take it? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes the future begins not with a sword or a crown, but a child who was never supposed to exist.